Hi, I'm Lisa. Welcome back to Biblical Reality Check. Today we're going to be looking at the parable of the mustard seed. At first glance, this parable sounds like a children's story about growth. However, both psychologically and spiritually, this parable is a masterful blueprint for transformation. The parable can be found in Matthew 13, verses 31 to 32, Mark 4, verses 30 to 32, and Luke 13, verses 18 to 19. In it, Jesus compares the kingdom of heaven to a mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field. And although the seed is smaller than all other seeds, when it's full grown, it's larger than all the garden plants and forms large branches so that the birds can come and nest in them. A mustard seed is a symbol of insignificance. It's tiny, ordinary, and almost invisible. Yet Jesus says this is what the kingdom of heaven is like, the smallest of seeds that becomes the largest of garden plants, with branches so large that birds come and nest in them. Jesus says that a man took a mustard seed and sowed it in his field. As in the two parables we examined earlier, the parable of the sower and the parable of the wheat and tares, the field here represents the inner world of the human psyche. If we follow the comparison between the mustard seed and the fully grown tree, the smallest thing that enters this inner field of a human mind is a thought. A single thought can appear unexpectedly, yet it has the potential to grow into patterns of thinking and actions that are significant and even life-changing. Unlike something dramatic, like a supernatural revelation, or explosive, like a sudden overhaul of your entire life, I think Jesus is saying that awakening to the kingdom of heaven begins quietly with a thought, a possibility, an almost imperceptible shift in perception that eventually leads to a new way of seeing yourself and the world. In Jungian psychology, this is the moment a new insight enters the psyche. In neuroscience, it is the formation of a new neural pathway. I think Jesus intentionally chooses the smallest of seeds to make a psychological point. Transformation begins before you actually feel transformed. In the early stages of change and growth, nothing looks different, nothing really feels different, and outwardly, nothing seems to be actually happening. That's why people often doubt their progress. They expect awakening to feel dramatic, but Jesus says it begins microscopically beneath the surface. In neuroscience, the mustard seed mirrors the principle of neuroplasticity, where new pathways begin as faint, fragile connections. They strengthen only through repetition and attention, which is what Jesus reinforces in the parable of the wise and foolish builders when he says, quote, "Everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on rock," unquote. That's because awareness without embodiment changes nothing. Practice is what rewires neural pathways. Practice is what integrates the shadow. And practice is what moves truth from concept into your internal architecture so that your behavior is reorganized around it. Jesus says the mustard seed becomes a tree. This is not completely accurate because, botanically speaking, mustard seeds do not grow into actual trees. Instead, they grow into large, sprawling shrubs that can reach anywhere from 6 to 15 feet tall, depending on the variety and climate. This makes these plants invasive, unruly, and difficult to control. Once they take root, they spread aggressively and can take over fields. However, Jesus is not giving a botany lesson. He is teaching a psychological truth, and that is that small shifts in consciousness create large scale transformation over time. He is describing the law of expansion, where the tiniest of seeds expands into something stable, rooted, expansive, sheltering, and structurally transformed. There's an interesting parallel here. In modern cosmology, the universe is said to have expanded from an extremely condensed state, from what appears paradoxically as something almost infinitely small. From that compression came everything we now see: space, structure, complexity, and life. Jesus is pointing to the same pattern with the tiny mustard seed. He is saying that transformation does not begin with dominance or scale, but with something small, concentrated, and alive, and that once released, reorganizes everything around it. Metaphorically, the tiniest of seeds growing into the largest of plants also describes how the psyche transforms in awakening. A small shift in awareness, once nurtured, becomes a new identity, a new way of being, a new internal architecture. A single insight can rewire a lifetime of conditioning. A single moment of awareness can interrupt an old pattern. A single new belief can reshape your entire identity. So when Jesus compares the kingdom of heaven to a mustard seed, he is not saying something small becomes impressive. He is saying once that single insight, that single moment of awareness, that single new belief takes root, it does not ask for permission to grow. It naturally expands and overtakes your old identity, sense of being, and internal architecture. Then, once the inner architecture has changed, life reorganizes naturally around it. You may start to see that old roles no longer fit, familiar patterns lose their hold, and certain environments and relationships begin to feel small. This is why Jesus never tells people to make the kingdom grow. He tells them to let it take root so it can grow on its own. And then Jesus adds a detail that many overlook. He says, quote, "The birds of the air come and nest in its branches," unquote. In biblical symbolism, birds often represent thoughts, impulses, or aspects of the psyche. Before awakening, the inner life is often organized around survival, performance, control, image, and avoidance. That kind of inner architecture has very limited space for certain parts of the psyche. Things like grief, fear, intuition, creativity, vulnerability, unresolved emotion, and truth that disrupts identity have nowhere stable to rest. They arise, but they don't belong anywhere yet. So they either get suppressed, get acted out impulsively, get projected onto others, get numbed, or get turned into anxiety, shame, or compulsion. In other words, they fly around the mind, but they can't settle. In the parable, the birds represent the parts of you that, before awareness takes root, have no place to land. Jesus says the mustard seed grows until the birds of the air come and nest in its branches. The plant has grown large and stable enough to provide support, shelter, rest, and safety. In terms of consciousness, integration creates enough inner coherence that the previously repressed or chaotic parts of ourselves finally have somewhere to belong. The integrated self becomes a structure strong enough to hold the entire complexity of who you are. For example, before awakening, you feel sadness, so you distract yourself. You feel anger, and you repress it or explode. You feel intuition, but you doubt it. You feel fear, but you deny it. Those emotions and feelings have no place to land. After growth and integration, sadness can be felt without collapse, anger can be listened to without acting it out, intuition can be trusted, and fear can be held without denial. Your inner branches are strong enough now to integrate them into your whole being. The parable of the mustard seed tells us that the kingdom, the awakened state, begins as something tiny, internal, and almost imperceptible. But once planted and rooted, it expands into something strong enough to hold our entire inner world. In the next parable we'll be looking at, Jesus continues this theme of inner transformation, not through growth, but through permeation. The parable of the leaven is a story about how awakening doesn't just grow, it spreads. Thanks for watching.